According to Lindsay Layton, a reporter for the Washington Post, a typical student takes 112 mandated standardized tests between pre-kindergarten classes and 12th grade. She adds that 8th graders in the United States spend an average of 25.3 hours during the school year taking standardized tests. Valerie Strauss, another reporter for the Washington Post, adds that in the 2014-2015 school year, students sat over 6,500 times for tests, taking tests with over 401 titles. These statistics reveal the reality of standardized testing in our nation's schools. Yes, it is necessary to monitor student progress, but our nation has become too reliant on standardized testing, and it is harming our children, teachers, and parents. Every parent, teacher, government official, school administrator, and etc. should consider the impact standardized testing is having on our children and the future of America. This is a topic that needs to be reconsidered, and I have a few solutions to the problem. I spent the last semester of college at Concordia University in Seward, Nebraska, taking courses in elementary and early childhood education. These classes covered students with disabilities, child development psychology, an intro to education course, and a course on early childhood education. With these courses, I learned information on a variety of topics, including the impact of standardized testing on education. I feel this topic will have a large impact on me and my future career as a teacher, as I will have to administer these tests to my students. I have also done additional research on the topic, so I feel I'm very qualified to talk to you on this issue. As I said before, our nation's emphasis and reliance on standardized testing because of the No Child Left Behind Act is not only an unfair way to measure and compare all students, but it is also crippling the education students receive while harming the mental well-being of both students and teachers. There are better alternatives and policies that should be implemented to measure student intelligence. Let's focus on the problem first. Through the research I have done and information I have learned in my classes, I have come to the conclusion that schools in the United States place too much of an emphasis on testing in schools. This causes many problems for students, teachers, and parents alike. According to the article, Background of the Issue, Standardized Tests, published on procon.org, a nonprofit, objective charity that provides well-sourced, unbiased information on controversial issues, there are several cons when it comes to standardized testing. The first of these cons is that standardized testing has not improved student achievement. The No Child Left Behind Act, which will be discussed in detail later, was passed in 2002. Since then, the United States went down in world rankings in math and science, with no change in reading. Since then, there has been no evidence of improvement. The second of these cons is that standardized tests measure only a small portion of what education is meaningful. These tests cannot measure things like creativity, motivation, endurance, self-discipline, critical thinking, and honesty. There's so much more to education than math, science, and reading. There needs to be a way to incorporate a broader range of topics and talents. Another con of standardized testing is that teachers are under so much pressure for their students to do well in the exams. School and teacher funding depend on these tests. Because of this pressure, teachers feel that they have to teach to the test, taking away from other important aspects of learning. Also, with this focus on teaching the test, schools have to narrow their curriculum and take away time on school studies and the arts in order to focus on the math, science, and reading. A last con is that standardized tests are unfair and discriminatory against non-English speakers and students with disabilities. Students who are still learning English are required to take these tests, written in English, before they've even mastered the language. Students with disabilities, whose brains might not function like an average student, are required to take standardized tests, often without any accommodations. An article by Cindy Long, a writer for the National Education Association, tells a story that exemplifies how inappropriate it is for these students to be required to take the tests and how difficult it is for the parents. The story reads, 11-year-old Florida student Ethan Radisky was born with brain damage. Even though he was blind, had cerebral palsy, and had trouble saying basic words like yes and no, he was forced to take a state-mandated standardized test over a 2-week period last year. After a long struggle, his mother finally got him a waiver, only to have to prove to the state again this year that Ethan was in no condition to take the test. He was in a morphine coma, she told officials, but they weren't satisfied. His mother also wrote a strong letter to school officials. In her letter, she asked how the questions were entirely inappropriate for her son's cognitive level, as he didn't comprehend questions about clocks, staplers, or even food. She went on to describe how physically harmful it was for her son to sit in his wheelchair for so long, saying he often developed pressure sores from sitting so long. She also said her son developed respiratory infections from fluids pooling up in his lungs from the long testing sessions. As you can see from this story, standardized testing was not beneficial to Ethan in any way. It was harmful and degrading. Like his mother, many people would ask the question, why would this child be forced to take an exam like this? Thomas Armstrong, PhD, the executive director of the American Institute for Learning and Human Development, presents more reasons why, in his opinion, standardized tests are worthless. He says that standardized tests are administered in an artificial learning environment. Students are timed, prohibited from talking, asking questions, using references or learning devices, and getting up and moving around. These conditions are far from being similar to natural learning. He also adds that standardized tests create stress. Some students just don't do well when it comes to high-pressure testing, but excel in showing their knowledge in other, more natural ways. Students realize that there's a lot of pressure on them to do well. Due to a large amount of stress put on the students, they face psychological and physical harm. So what is the cause of these problems, and why are standardized tests emphasized so much in the United States? The answer is the No Child Left Behind Act, signed into law on January 8, 2002 by President George W. Bush. Allison Klein, a reporter for Education Week, described that under this act, schools are required to test students in grade 3 through 8 every year in reading, math, and English. They're also required to report the results. Under the law, schools have a tool called the Adequate Yearly Progress that sets annual achievement targets. If the school does not reach this target for 2 years or more, they face serious sanctions such as being required to offer tutoring, the possibility of being shut down, dealing with a large amount of government interference, or being required to use Title I funds for specific purposes required by the state. This can be very hazardous for schools in poverty-stricken neighborhoods especially. These schools are already poor and struggle with attendance rates and finding qualified teachers. When their students don't meet the requirements, the school is required to set aside a portion of their already small amount of funds. With this situation, it is very difficult to make improvements in any other areas of the school, leaving them in a constant cycle for failure. Like I said before, it is important to measure student progress and knowledge, but I think there are better ways to do it than standardized testing. Through my research, I have found what parents and schools are doing about the issue, policies that are in progress, and viable alternatives for the issue. First of all, parents in some states are taking a strong stand against standardized testing and participating in the opt-out movement. This is a movement across the nation of students and parents refusing to take standardized tests. According to Abe Pawlowski, a reporter for Today.com, some 200,000 students in New York declined to take standardized tests in 2015, with another 20,000 in Illinois. According to Layton, Miami-Dade County Public Schools in Florida are taking steps to reduce the amount of testing as well. In early 2015, the district cut the number of end-course exams from 300 to 10 and eliminated them entirely from elementary schools. California, Minnesota, Mississippi, Alaska, Rhode Island, and South Carolina also eliminated their high school graduation test requirements in recent years. Second, the U.S. Department of Education sees the need to reduce testing and is taking steps to cut out the number of standardized tests given to students. In 2015, they released a testing action plan that outlines principles for fewer and smarter assessments. One of these principles is that tests must be worth taking. Tests should be aligned to what the students are learning. They should provide useful information that will be useful to the students. Another principle is that tests should be fair in equity and educational opportunity. This means that students with disabilities and English language learners will be provided accommodations that reflect what students know and what they can do. A last principle in the action plan is that tests should be time limited. The goal of this is to reduce the amount of time students are taking standardized tests, allowing them to spend more time on learning. The plan ensures that no child spends more than 2% of classroom time taking tests. Lastly, there are several alternatives that would be better to measure student progress. What schools could use instead of standardized tests, an article on the National Public Radio Education website suggests two viable options. First, they suggest using a sampling method. With this approach, the same tests are used, however, a smaller sample of students are tested every year. This method would reduce the amount of stress for students and teachers. Second, they suggest using a stealth method. This method uses software created by major textbook publishers. The software allows students to practice math and English over the course of the year instead of taking specific time to stop and test. The software can compile data of the whole year and chart student progress. It also provides a fun way for students to practice skills they're learning in the regular classroom setting. Jessica Terrell, a writer for the District Administration, the most regularly read publication for K-12 district-level school leaders nationwide, offers three more options. First, she suggests having assessments double as instruction. With this method, assessments would mirror classroom instruction and include creative and critical thinking skills. These assessments would be scored using traditional rubrics and be aligned to Common Core standards. This method would be beneficial because it would eliminate the term testing and flow with regular classroom instruction, rather interfering with it like standardized tests do. It would also be appropriate to test children with disabilities and English language learners, as it can be easily accommodated. Second, Terrell suggests using presentations. This approach has students perform presentations in core subjects. The scoring scale would depend on the subject and include things like problem solving, reasoning, creativity, etc. For example, students might upload a video of a creative science experiment to show all of these traits. Students also create portfolios that show progress from year to year. The presentations are all relevant and based on classroom instruction. This approach is beneficial because it not only includes creativity, but it allows children to display their strong point in something that is interesting to them. Lastly, she suggests integrating assessments daily. She suggests using exit tickets or personal whiteboards daily to measure what students are learning. With this approach, children don't feel like they're being tested, and it is integrated into daily instruction. It is also a good way to assess English learners and children with disabilities. It can also involve a wide variety of topics and subjects. All in all, standardized testing needs to be reduced or eliminated completely. As I have just presented, there are several other options that can be used to measure progress. Our nation relies too much on the stressful standardized testing that was brought about due to the No Child Left Behind Act. These tests are an unfair and negative way to monitor student learning, as I discussed the major cons to standardized testing. Many parents, students, schools, states, and even government agencies are in the process of fighting and changing the assessment method in our nation. All of these parties are pushing to enforce the variety of better alternatives. In closing, I encourage you to think about the children and the future of our nation and to fight to reform assessment methods in the United States.